everyone. Welcome to the new episode of the CCIR Student Spotlight. We have today a special guest, Zoe Smith Holiday, who is a high school student in Denver and currently working on a project with CCIR on the civil rights movement. Welcome, Zoe.
Hi, thank you for having me.
How you doing?
Good. Snowy here in Denver, but things could be worse, I guess.
Um, so, if you don't mind, just give a brief introduction of who you are and where you are in your life right now.
I am a junior in high school at the Denver School of the Arts, where I started attending the Denver School of the Arts as a creative writer in sixth grade, and I've been there ever since. And I think I think working on writing, especially, a lot of times, especially in the writing community, I feel like creative writers are more perceived as being the more artistic or like activist type of writer, I guess, as opposed to more academic scholarly writers. So as I was working in a more poetry or creative nonfiction based environment, at first I kind of assumed it was more the academic or scholar writing essayists who are more conformist, but I felt like the Cambridge program is a good way for me to get out of my comfort zone and try to find a more activist or like change based perspective, motivated by more analytical, like creative nonfiction, as opposed to just poetry as we might expect normally. So yes.
Super cool. So tell me a little bit more about your project with CCR. So you're working currently with Dr. Devlin from Cambridge, who's a historian. And tell me about your initial idea of your project, how it's evolved, what's it about?
Yeah, I think I began in the project with a more like vague, I guess, sense of what I wanted to do. And a lot of it was stoked by, I guess, interest in my life based around particularly like events during the summer with Black Lives Matter protests and other just, I guess, racialized events and conflicts in the world. So originally I started more just feeling like, oh, I really want to express this in a certain way, but I'm not necessarily sure how I'm going to get there yet. And I definitely also knew that I wanted to focus specifically somewhat on the Black Panther movement, and especially in relation to Marxism or somewhat like socialist ideology, how the two relate, since I felt like perhaps not in formal writing, but I think in the news in general, it's not necessarily something that we hear about. I mean, Marxism in general, it's not really a topic that people are super knowledgeable on, but I think I started feeling like some of the things that we see in the present and organizations and such, they could benefit from hearing or learning more about um, those past movements. And today today where I am with my project, I would say as I've researched more since when I started the program with Dr. Devlin, we started out generally talking about the civil rights in general and civil rights and also the Black Panthers to a good extent. And I felt like now I want to focus definitely more on my larger final paper on globally in some ways. Of course, I don't want to go too broad to the point where it becomes like 20 pages long or something, but I do want it to relate more to globally, since I think naturally as an American student, my perspective was skewed and my interpretation of Marxism and racial movements, I guess, was skewed towards the US and US concepts, kind of not exceptionalism, but focus, I guess. So I think studying more about that, I've definitely found I wanted to incorporate more about Marxism and movements in the greater African diaspora as opposed to just in the US. And I felt like I was also able to have, even I'm working through it more now, even now, but I'm still working on having a more I guess heightened understanding of concepts which are somewhat sensationalized in our world today, especially with the Black Panthers. I felt like even in my first few readings that I was given by Dr. Devlin, I felt like I was able to change my assumptions, or I guess my opinions about the Black Panthers, and I guess adjust my worldview to something that might be a little more accurate and less, I guess, Hollywoody of what we usually think of as like a Black Power movement. So yeah, those are some of the
Tell
ways
me a
that.
little bit about this change of perspective, because um, when you speak of Hollywood, I literally just watched Judas and the Black Messiah. So maybe that's a good place to start, which is, as someone who now sort of knows the history a little more, would you say that there are certain well, of course there are sensational aspects to that film, but um, what can you see? I don't know if you've seen it yet. Have you?
No, I haven't actually seen that one
Okay. Yeah.
recently. Yeah, most of the reading that I read was focused on older, I guess, like movies from the 80s, like I think it's just Panthers. Was it called by I'm blanking on the movie director, but yeah, it's a similar vein, and it was in some ways, you're right, just that. And well, somewhat, yeah, a lot of like racial Hollywood, I guess, films or big major motion picture films that have been coming out, getting more traction lately, like Get Out, different kind of veins of that. Yeah, I felt like there was a lot that I was surprised by, but also made a lot of sense when I read into it more, especially in like the examples that you were talking about more recently, how in particular we're kind of fed, I guess, a very like specific and oftentimes more hyper masculine perspective about the civil rights movement in general, but especially more branching off, I guess, movements like the Black Panthers, even though, and not even necessarily saying that people act like it's all men, but I feel like even in the way that the story is presented with women who were part of the Black Panthers, oftentimes they, in at least in Hollywood, like fictionalized versions or depictions of them, they would have similarly a more kind of tough guy attitude, I guess, in a way. And it was really fascinating reading about the history of, oh, I think it was the Van Peebles, who wrote the Panthers movies series in the 80s. And it was really fascinating seeing how it still has very much, and of course it's hard because you don't want to necessarily knock the Black directors or writers who are bringing films to light today, because certainly we wouldn't necessarily have that perspective before, even in Hollywood. But there is a lot of focus on, I guess, violence, and traditionally what we consider, like, it's very like cis normative and cis heteronormative, and kind of focused around like Black power, like literally and necessarily not focusing so much on, which was kind of the contention back in the day, I guess, was that it focused less so on the intellectual side of the Black Panthers and the civil rights movement, which were equally as important, and which was really fascinating to read about, because specifically with the 1980s example, since one of the founders of the Black Panthers, Huey Newton, he generally had a pretty amicable view of like the Black Hollywood's perspective in major motion pictures that had come out, kind of retelling the Black Panther story. But on the other hand, Bobby Seale, who is the other main co-founder, generally was actually one of the harshest critics, and said that it focusing on all the kind of action, like hood, not hood, of like kind of the Black action movie-esque title, was taking away from the intellectual struggle and, I guess, academic knowledge and prowess of many of the Black Panthers and their supporters.
And also, I suppose, I think the new, I won't say too much about.
Don't
It was
spoil
really
it.
good. It was quite good, I think, and I don't think it quite falls prey um, to these old tropes because
Yeah.
it one you for me it was especially striking because I in my undergrad years I took a lot of classes on uh, modern Chinese history and the influence of Maoism in the film.
Mm.
The film was really alert to the influences of Maoism on the Black Panther movement, and I could hear the quotes um, of Mao through the mouths of the main character, and also the emphasis on the community building aspect. But I find the yeah, so that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so uh, I'm also curious about earlier you mentioned that there was some sort of experiences early in the summer with the Black Lives Matter movement. I have a good friend in Denver, so he lived right near City Hall. Um, so I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what you experienced during those months and how that shaped your perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I think especially in the beginning, and of course everything is in some ways shifted in the COVID world dynamic. It's a lot more distant acting or activism, I guess, in some ways, like physically, even if it's not necessarily mentally distant. But I think, especially in Denver, I think, speaking as a Black person who's from Denver, I think that a lot of the frustration or I guess conflict for me personally was that I think, especially during the summer, just nationally, people started feeling like there was more awareness about Black Lives Matter and police brutality issues. However, I somewhat felt like the sensationalism was a little bit late since the Black Lives Matter movement has been um, present and significant for quite a few years, like going back like 2015. And even, of course, before that, there were a lot of issues with police brutality and in Denver and nationwide. So I think that was something that was, I guess, interesting to note is that, and that was in some ways what informed my perspective was not necessarily feeding into what is kind of the sensationalized like news media storytelling. And it is actually really fascinating because, and this was really, I was researching this more recently, so I'm in no way like an expert or anything on it, but reading about how a similar, since I felt like personally, especially in a lot of Black groups, with youth, people were starting to feel like, well, what was it like, with like other Black powerful leaders or movements of the past in America and kind of somewhat worldwide. So I think there was, in addition to a heightened awareness generally in the mainstream about Black Lives Matter, in Black communities and circles, I feel like there was more interest in the Black Panthers and just the civil rights movements in general. And in some ways, that was somewhat of what inspired me. And I think it's interesting too because a similar thing actually happened in the 90s where Black youth in particular were shocked and I guess angered by a lot of racial issues and events, I guess, going on that they felt like were kind of being ignored. And they were similarly feeling like reaching back to the Black Panthers and different civil rights movements, like, well, what were they doing? Since a lot of it is almost iconicized and we view it in a certain lens for like, well, what were the great leaders of then doing? And so, yeah, that was a lot of what inspired me to look deeper into the problem and I guess consider it more also globally since I think it's a lot of America focused. Like I feel like a lot of people, whenever I talk to people who don't live in the US or aren't from the US, they know a lot about, or a relatively well amount about the US, but Americans don't tend to know very much about other places a lot, or at least if they do, it's because of an ulterior, like their family lives there or something. There's not really much formal education about other
Mhm,
places very much, especially not outside of the Western world.
mhm,
So that was partly definitely what inspired me.
mhm. So, um, one of the striking things about the um, the civil rights movement is that it was quite international. There was and the I think two really interesting aspects, and I wonder, I want to hear your thoughts on maybe what you have learned in studying the civil rights movement, perhaps as a uh, young activist or organizer. What do you think are the lessons that you've obtained? Because one of the striking things about the civil rights movement is its incredible ability to organize, to build coalitions, and to maintain sort of international presence. And I wonder whether you see any differences, things that you can that you feel like maybe the Black Lives Matter movement can learn from this. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think definitely it's hard because I feel like with history in general, a lot of the times it's really easy to take a cynical approach on the present, kind of somewhat like in the good old days type thing, but also just feeling like maybe even as the issue has progressed, I think it's easy to feel like people aren't as passionate necessarily as they used to be, which I don't think is entirely correct, but it is easy to feel that way, especially during COVID when everything's very isolated and takes place mainly over social media a lot of the time. But one of the things that I learned and found most interesting about the Black Panther movement and the civil rights movement in general in relation to today was, I think, bringing a heightened focus to the academic side of academic, not necessarily the right word, but intellectual, I guess. And in some ways, even intellectual seems somewhat loaded since it is very subjective. And also, I think a lot of times people use somewhat of like IQ, like articulation type things to kind of invalidate people of color, even when they're trying to send a very powerful message. But I think that was one of the things that was most fascinating to me about the Black Panther Party in relation to today was it was built on not just people who wanted to make a change and who were deeply affected by these issues, which is of course important, but also and probably at the same time, probably the same person, not necessarily like a bunch of different people, because a lot of people were affected by the issue and were um, doing more academic or professional, I guess, research on these topics. And I think a lot of what made the Black Panther Party so potent for the time it was, for the very short time that it was in practice, or I guess organized before it was disassembled. And I think part of the reason why it was disassembled is because it became so beneficial and crucial so quickly that the FBI and other sources started feeling like it was just becoming a threat because it didn't necessarily offer the things that other movements had before, but was the just thinking conceptually about all the issues. And a lot of the like people will hear, I think, about some of the programs and such. I think at the surface level, I think a lot of people's perception is of the people holding guns and they've got sunglasses on and they're like standing outside of a church or something, like kind of like it's like a mixtape cover or something. But when you go a lot deeper, and I think even then, I think some people have awareness of the different programs for free medical assistance and a lot of like food, like student free and reduced lunch programs and such. But even then, I think people aren't necessarily aware of a lot of the work that they were doing was based in demands, but they were also organized. Basically, there was a lot more. planning and thought. And like you said, with Maoism, like Bobby Seale and Huey Newton used to go around their campus handing out Maoist pamphlets and researching a lot of the different conceptual, I guess, ideas behind what they might be thinking about, which I think in the Black Lives Matter movement of today and just surrounding police brutality in general, I think there's a lot more confusion, which or emotional resonance, which I think is a powerful tool, of course. But at the same time, I think there also needs to be a heavy set of organization and being like, okay, well, once we get this, what are we going to do with it? Once we get this funding or this political power, where are we going to go with it? And having people who are really strategic, I guess, and organized is really important that I think the movements of today could certainly benefit from.
Cool. So I want to take a step back and maybe talk a little bit more about the this experience of doing more academic research. And I want to hear your thoughts about um, what you've learned maybe in engaging in this kind of practice, and maybe some thoughts about the differences between doing this type of work and maybe the kinds of learning that you do in history classes in school.
Yes, for sure. I think often it's easy for people to kind of look down on like the kind of what they perceive as like a safe space kind of thing or something or setup. But at the same time, honestly, especially with my school and where I live, I felt like a lot of the times it was honestly partly the opposite, where going to like a mostly like white kind of pseudo progressive school was proved very challenging to I guess exist in that space. They kind of feels like there's a designated space for people of color or people who are thinking, I guess, outside of the pseudo progressive what's okay, I guess, to think or rebel against. People who are thinking more so outside of that or even trying to push it. A lot of the times, even like others at the school, especially, well, not especially, even like teachers are can be very reactionary to trying to address somewhat those concerns. And that was part of the reason why I actually did the CCR Cambridge program because I was having a really poor experience with my AP US history classes at my school, where I ended up basically having to drop the class because my teacher was having us read like very, I guess, like very dehumanizing pieces, I guess, about slavery. And it was from the perspective of Thomas Jefferson. And then it wouldn't necessarily be that bad, but when I brought those concerns to my teachers, and I was like, if you're going to give us these very hateful, I guess, reading about Black people, and I'm the only Black person in the class, and we also have no discussion about the readings themselves after you just, gave us these like pretty shocking readings and then just had us like, okay, bye, go to lunch. It causes a lot of, um, I guess, self hatred among students, I feel like, and I felt that both myself. And, but when I would try to bring those concerns to my teachers and such, a lot of them would, or not a lot of them, but especially my AP US history teacher would be very like harassing me outside the classroom and treating me kind of like I was being a, a kind of tardy student or I wasn't paying attention, even though I was actually making me and my family were making a direct decision for me to not attend his class and drop out and take another class because I felt like the way I was being treated in his class was not right. And when I tried to bring it up to him, people like students and teachers were very, I felt like frustrating, kind of not really speaking honestly about the subject or how they really felt. So that was a lot of what inspired me to actually apply for the Cambridge class, because then I would be able to more so have a more open, first of all, like one-on-one discussion where it would be more individualized, but something where also I don't feel afraid to bring up um, something that I want to address just generally with the teacher, and just something that's more like a professional space where I don't feel like um, people are going to let their, I guess, biases get the best of them, I guess, in a way, which is what I felt like I was experiencing a lot at my school, which is unfortunate, but also I felt like I knew that there were places I could go to, I guess, to receive a different experience.
Mm. Yeah, so that's one. I'm really sorry to hear about the AP US history class. That sounds awful. Um, but I guess when you said that it's more of a professional experience, I want to hear a little bit maybe more about that. What do you mean by that, and what is it like, I guess, to do more professional historical research rather than um, because I do think at the end of the day, a high school history as a part of the national curriculum will inevitably, almost inevitably, unless you have a really exceptional history teacher who is keenly aware of these issues, end up being ideological and a little bit um, uh, not good. But yeah, so I'm interested to hear what maybe the big difference was doing academic research at this sort of higher level where criticism and self-consciousness was maybe a little more heightened.
Yeah, and you're totally right. I think in general that is a pretty big issue, or I guess common complaint of the education system as a whole, especially in high school, when you're getting to the age where you're more able to engage critically and like disagree, I guess, with people ideologically. However, the high school education as a whole often does feel very primary still, and not necessarily um, right. That's, yeah, like professional, and I guess that's somewhat of what I mean by professional, is like something that's a more like definitely college level experience where you're being taught how to think, not like what to think as much, and even just being able to engage with students and teachers alike in a way that isn't super I guess, I mean, obviously it's always going to be to a degree or political, I guess, in a way, because it's like universities are still political institutions. But I do think that at the end of the day, having a secondary school more like experience is incredibly was incredibly beneficial to me, and encourages, I guess, just deeper thinking and like you say, more self-awareness and consciousness in general, I would say.
Mm. Yeah, I wonder if this experience has given you a little more confidence in education.
Yeah, for sure. Right, it makes me feel like at least there's some places you can go where you can experience something different, even if kind of the main feeder isn't necessarily up to what you'd like it to be.
Mm. So tell me a little bit more about your more, I guess, personal relationship that you've uh, personal working relationship with Dr. Devlin. How has that been? What was the process of like working through your thoughts with him, developing your project, and so on?
Yeah, it's been really helpful, I think, for me, not just in this specific program or area, but just in general, building my skills in historical and more objective analysis and writing in general, like essay writing. Um, because as I said before, I was more used to a poetic standpoint, which is great in certain contexts, but then you also want to have a more full range, I guess, of communication as a writer, not just fiction and nonfiction, I guess, in terms of prose and other things. So I would say, particularly working, like for instance, we would do a lot of, I would do like weekly essay somewhat prompts where I'll do shorter essay prompts. I'll kind of write to them and do um, a full length or like a couple page long edited essay that I was pretty like polished. I try to make it pretty polished, but isn't necessarily like, it's obviously not perfect or anything. So we can kind of work through how I can work to make my reading or to make my writing stronger and more tailored to the subject at hand. Since I do, as a creative writer, artistic type, tend to stray sometimes from the topic at hand. So I think working with that and also additionally working with not necessarily having super subjective, I guess, meaning come through all the time. I think in history, especially, it can be impactful to have pretty consistent references to the present and your worldview, but at the same time, it is also important to maintain more objective or definitely a fact-based analysis, as opposed to something that we would see more in the news today, where it's somewhat of a interpretive writing, interpretive analysis of the situation. So those are things that I definitely felt like just made me stronger overall. And also going through all these different readings that we've been going through about like particularly a lot of like civil rights transcripts of interviews or court cases and articles, especially from the time period. A lot of primary sources has been very helpful. Just in general, I feel like for myself, since it's just nice to read a lot of just read in general, but since I think it can be hard to find time to do that, but also reading about the subjects, like and actually reading the theory and things behind it instead of having a more politically socialized perspective and kind of understanding words as their buzzword or their main or their kind of basic meaning that we're used to, as opposed to really going in and being like, okay, well, what did, for instance, like Karl Marx or different readers or not different writers and analysis at the time specifically, what were they really saying and what context was it in? And what can we learn from that? So I think those are some things that have been really helpful.
Okay, so I have maybe one last slightly vague question to ask before I start sort of wrapping things up. But one of the themes, it seems like, in our conversation thus far is that you keep sort of mentioning going in depth and really this idea of getting deeper into things. What do you think that means? What does it mean to really dig deep into a particular subject or get beyond the surface level of a particular buzzword, or yeah, into a particular theory?
Yeah, particularly for myself, I think especially since I'm someone of like a learner, like for myself when I'm reading or digesting material, I like to have a more general sense of it in application and not just in one context. Like many people, I think that um, I guess I give an example for myself is um, with, well, I'll say trying to build, I guess, a picture or a narrative of related not just to a single concept or a single event, but somewhat more writing almost a yeah, almost a narrative. And it is more like my, in a way, I guess, artistic brain coming out. But like for instance, reading about Marxism and communism, socialism, and how a lot of communist ideals, especially in the original manifesto, were truly based on the nature of humanity and almost like anthropologists, even though it is an economic study within itself, focused on economy and politics. It also speaks to just human, I guess, or arguing human truths or what's humans are naturally drawn to, which was something that I found particularly fascinating for myself, such as, I mean, and a lot of it, of course, rings true for me, especially feeling like a lot of capitalist ideals, it is based on being a human being and kind of feeling naturally as an animal, kind of greed in a way, and feeling desire for higher potential, I guess, sometimes, oftentimes, like in the very extreme system that we have and that's growing today. Like, for instance, someone like 10 people owning like 99% of the world's wealth or something. A lot of the time, it's based on almost like letting our, I guess, animal brain in a way run amok and letting letting kind of a battle between idealism and realism, kind of focusing on those aspects. And I thought it was really like fascinating to read deeper into that and how we could, I guess, existentially get closer to promoting or establishing a system that is equal for all people and is actually more tailored to what we know is kind of human impulse, which is not always a great thing. And yeah, so I think that is one of the things that I've found really important for myself. And like I said, a lot of it comes from my creative writing artistic side, I guess. But when I think about it more, I think that a lot of historical influence or power is held in telling a story of history as opposed to just a narrative. And I think a lot of times people like to think, oh, well, the history books that we have in school, the textbooks, they are objective. They are just the telling of how it is. But when really, especially in the US, it's not just it's some objective reading. They have a meaning to interpret behind it, just like everything else. And a lot of times those do appeal to mainstream American values. So I guess reading into more about narrative, I think, has been really important, and just creating an essay or a story, I guess, of history with particularly with like imagery and different more, I guess, what we would consider more abstract or creative skills.
So moving forward, how do you think this experience will help you as a creative writer, as a young activist, and how might you be integrating this project into your future?
Well, kind of like what I said before, I think I've learned to, or at least attempt to have a more globally based perspective as opposed to a more unionation, like America focused perspective. And it's hard not to have that when you're an American student growing up in that system. But trying to incorporate more knowledge and understanding from elsewhere and not kind of just feeling like the default is everything that your teacher at school gives you and that's kind of the end all be all, or that's the most reliable source possible. Kind of just thinking and questioning a lot more, being more critical about the world, I guess, and in my assumptions for myself, I guess. And of course, nobody's going to be able to do it perfectly, but trying to get more towards focusing less on things that I might traditionally, as an individual, like fall towards, like as because I think we all kind of have ideas or feelings that we kind of tend towards as people, individuals and groups. So I think just trying to have a more critical conversation, I guess, in my writing and with myself is important to me and something that I really want to continue doing.
It was a super interesting conversation, and best of luck to your project. And